So tonight we're going to talk about anti-Semitism from a sports perspective. And I've done this class, a version of this class I did for a Hebrew school a few years ago. And, you know, it really struck me that the kids of today really their idea of anti-Semitism is maybe what they hear about stuff that's happening in Europe. They don't necessarily get it directly like they did back, and then to have it happen in sports, it's kind of eye-opening for them. So it was really an interesting experience to kind of go through some of what's happened to Jews in sports and the anti-Semitism that has occurred. And I'm going to start with a story about the 1936 Olympics. Some of you might know this story, and if you don't, it's still a good story that needs to be told because it probably is the most egregious example of anti-Semitism in sports history. Incredibly, the games were held in Berlin. Hitler had just come into power a few years earlier, and he's already was espousing his anti-Jewish policies. Things were starting to get bad for the Jews in Germany. And yet the Olympics were allowed to be held in Germany. And can you imagine that happening today? Maybe, you know, you look at next year's Winter Olympics, they're going to be in China, despite all the human rights issues they have there. So anyway, but back then, there were many calls for the U.S. to boycott the Olympics because of Hitler's policies. And ultimately, the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, Avery Brundage, said the team should go to Berlin. And Brundage, speaking of Illinois, went to Illinois, and he wasn't exactly a big fan of the Jews. He once said, well, listen to this quote, "In 40 years of Olympic history, I doubt if the number of Jewish athletes competing from all nations totaled 1% of those in the game. I believe 0.5% would be a higher percentage." Really, can you imagine? Maybe you can, given some of the climate today, but you know, you'll be hearing actually more about Brundage and his anti-Semitism in the next session on Israel and the Olympics. So the American team went to Germany, and everyone knows about Jesse Owens' heroics, an African-American, won 4 gold medals right in the face of Hitler and his vision for an Aryan race. However, the track team also included 2 Jewish sprinters, Sam Stoller and Marty Glickman, and they were supposed to run on the 4x100 relay team. And the morning of the event, they were told in a meeting, which you'll hear about in a minute, that they were being replaced. And one of the replacements was going to be Jesse Owens. Owens, who already won 3 gold medals, argued that the Jewish sprinter should be allowed to run. Olympic officials said no, and the Jews remained on the sideline. Marty Glickman knew the reasons. The U.S. didn't want to embarrass Hitler by having a Jewish athlete win a gold medal. And he tells his story here in this video.
We were aware of the fact that there was anti-Semitism in Germany. We just didn't know what Nazism was. Remember, this is from the perspective of 2 years before Kristallnacht. The Holocaust was not only not a thought, it didn't exist in our imagination, in our dreams. I was on the team. It was a goal I had sought. Holocaust was a word that I didn't even know in 1936. The 400-meter relay was selected beforehand. Sam Stoller would start. I was to run the second leg. Foy Draper run the third leg, and Frank Wyckoff run the anchor leg. The morning of the day we were supposed to run in the trial heats, we were called into a meeting, the 7 sprinters were, along with Dean Cromwell, the assistant head track coach, and Lawson Robertson, the head track coach. And Robertson announced to the 7 of us that he'd heard very strong rumors that the Germans were saving their best sprinters, hiding them to upset the American team in the 400-meter relay. And consequently, Sam and I were to be replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf. We were shocked. Sam was completely stunned. He didn't say a word in the meeting. Watching the final, all sorts of emotions flashed through my being. Frustration, certainly. Anger, certainly. I look out on the track and I see Metcalf passing runners down the backstretch. He ran the second leg. And that should be me out there. That should be me. That's me out there. Anti-Semitism was the basic reason, I believe, that Sam and I didn't get to run the Olympic Games. Here were the great black athletes who couldn't be kept off the winning podium. They were marvelous. But here were two rather obscure Jewish American athletes who could be kept from the winning podium so as not to further embarrass Adolf Hitler. But what happened to me was as nothing compared to that which took place later on. There was just no comparison. I was there, and that mattered. What took place was much, much more important afterwards.
So obviously he was very devastated by that event, and there's actually HBO did a documentary on him, I believe in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s, early 2000, where he went back to Munich to visit that stadium. It's still there. I mean, to Berlin. I'm sorry. So 66 years later, in 1998, the United States Olympic Committee, citing, quote, great evidence of anti-Semitism, presented Glickman with a special plaque, quote, in lieu of the gold medals they did not win. And so, but the fact that it took them 66 years is kind of a little bit embarrassing, and it's just an incredible story that happened. A postscript, some older people here might recognize the name of Marty Glickman for another reason. He became a prominent sports announcer in New York. And then he actually was a mentor to many sports announcers, including Marv Albert, Bob Costas, and several others. So that story is part of the Jewish history and of anti-Semitism. And sadly, anti-Semitism is still strong in many segments of today's society, including sports. Last summer, Deshaun Jackson of the Philadelphia Eagles posted an anti-Semitic tweet. The NFL fined Jackson, and he subsequently apologized. In the Premier League, the English Soccer League, Tottenham has a large fan base among its London's Jewish community, and often opposing fans regularly direct anti-Semitic abuse at supporters of the team. During a game in 2019, a fan was kicked out of the stadium for chanting about gassing the Jews. Really sad. Last summer, the Jewish Sports Heritage Association published a collection of articles documenting some of the stories in anti-Semitism. There's one about this. Bob Wexler, is a friend of mine, wrote a story about a Jewish hockey player, Larry Zeidel. In 1968, while playing for the Philadelphia Flyers, Zeidel had an encounter with Boston's Eddie Shack. Midway through the first period, Shack cross-checked Zeidel, igniting a big fight. They both started swinging the sticks, and the end result was each player needing 20 stitches to close their wounds. Zeig said he had no choice but to stand up for himself. He recalled, nearly an entire Boston team tried to intimidate me about being the only Jewish player in the league. They said they wouldn't be satisfied until they put me in the gas chamber. Again, pretty horrific stuff, but that's what happened. And you'll see it happen even more earlier in the 20th century, because naturally, since baseball was the dominant sport for Jewish athletes, there's numerous examples of anti-Semitism in the early 1900s. Ford Frick, a sports writer who would eventually become a commissioner, noted the obstacles encountered by early Jewish players. In 1925, he wrote, there must have been at least a half a hundred Jews in the game, but we'll never know their real names. During the early part of the century, the Jewish boys had tough sledding in the majors, and many of them changed their names. Indeed, there were at least 5 that we know of Cohens, C-O-H-E-N, who played Major League Baseball under different names. They went by, there was a Bowen, Corey, Kane, Ewig, and Cooney. And they did this obviously because they feared anti-Semitism and being a target. In 1980, Dorothy Corey Pitzenger, the widow of Edward Corey, who pitched for the White Sox in 1918, explained why her husband became Corey instead, changed from Cohen to Corey. And she said, the name was changed from Cohen to Corey due to ethnic slurs. We have a clipping in the scrapbook which noted that in his appearance in one of the Midwest League games, Ed was loudly and continuously derided about his ethnic background from a few of the unintelligent fans. And so this continued, and it actually led to a funny exchange that happened when these name changes even surprised other Jews. There was a player named Jimmy Reese. He was actually better, well, his baseball career was better known for being a one-time roommate of Babe Ruth. And noting the Babe's nighttime escapades, Reese famously said, "I room with the Babe's suitcase." He later was a coach for the California Angels in the 90s. But Reese happened in the 1920s. He was playing in the Pacific Coast League, and he played in a celebrity game in which the other team had a Jewish battery of pitcher-songwriter Harry Ruby and catcher Ike Danning. Too Jewish, right? So instead of using signals, Danning called the game in Yiddish, figuring that none of the other players would understand. Ruth slammed 4 hits in the game, and after the game, Ruby said to Reese, "I didn't know you were a good hitter, Jimmy." And Reese replied, "You also didn't know that my real name is Jaime Solomon." There you go. The climate, though, eventually did shift somewhat for Jews. In fact, it got to the point where in New York in the late 1920s, John McGraw, the Giants manager, trying to counter the popularity of Babe Ruth, actually went searching for a Jewish player to attract the city's massive Jewish population to the Polo Ground. And he found a player named Andy Cohen. He was the first player actually celebrated for being Jewish. And he started an opening day, 1928, he had a big game, and he was actually carried off the field by jubilant fans. You know, imagine that, a Jewish player being carried off the field, a Cohen, no less. Cohen told the story of how Jewish fans, many of them immigrants who did not know the game, used to go to the ballpark looking to buy tickets. And the ticket taker would say, "Where do you want to sit? Behind first? Behind third?" And they said, "No, we want to sit behind second base," because that's where Cohen played. Obviously, you can't sit behind second base. While Andy Cohen did not become the Jewish star that McGraw had envisioned, Harry Danning eventually filled that role. Danling was a 4-time All-Star catcher with .313 with 16 home runs in 1939. Of course, no player had a larger impact on his generation of Jewish fans than Detroit's Hank Greenberg, the Hammer, hammering Hank Greenberg. He was the first Jewish superstar in baseball, and you can make the argument that he was the most important American Jew of the first half of the 20th century. Yes, I think he's definitely in the top 5 because of the impact that he had on society and Jews in America. Hank grew up in New York, and he stood 6'4" with big, massive forearms, and he just exuded power. And he was scouted by the Yankees, of course. But at the time, they had a first baseman, a guy named Gehrig. Greenberg figured correctly he wouldn't get a chance with the Yankees and signed with the Detroit Tigers. Now, this was the 1930s, perhaps the most anti-Semitic decade in U.S. history. And Detroit was the hub of much of that anti-Semitism. And 2 of the loudest figures were Henry Ford and Father Charles Coughlin. We know Ford was a noted anti-Semite, and he actually bought a paper, the Dearborn Independent, so that he can continue to put out his anti-Semitic content. Father Coughlin was the most popular radio preacher of the 1930s, and he regularly denounced Jews on his Sunday program. And so this was what Greenberg went into in the 1930s. And of course, Greenberg, obviously, he immediately faced anti-Semitism and stereotyping from the beginning. He recalled a player from the South once said, "Hank, people tell me you're Jewish, but I can't believe it." "Why?" Hank said. And the other player said, "Because I heard that all Jews have horns in their heads, like the devil." Fans used to yell and throw things at him. And he said, "How the hell can you go up to the home plate every day and have some jerk call you a Jew bastard and more and not feel the pressure? If the ball players weren't doing it, the fans were. I used to get frustrated as hell. Sometimes I wanted to go into the stands and beat the blank out of them." His teammate, Bertie Tebbets, recalled, quote, "Except for Jackie Robinson, there was nobody in the history of the game who took more abuse than Hank Greenberg." Now think of that. I mean, that's just a huge telling statement. And yet, despite the rough treatment, Greenberg posted numbers that were off the charts. 1934, at the age of 24, he won the first of 2 American League MVP awards with 36 homers and 168 RBIs. In 1937, Greenberg had 184 RBIs. 184 RBIs, still an American League record. 1938, Greenberg had the most notable thing that happened in his career. He went after Babe Ruth's single-season home run record of 60 homers, and he was ahead of Ruth's pace going into September. Now, here's where kind of a myth and reality kind of comes in. In some people's mind, it looked like baseball players, other players, didn't want a Jew to break the most important record in American sports at the time. They argued that pitchers started to intentionally walk him and not give him any good pitches to hit. Again, what's the myth and what's the reality? And there's some facts going both ways. However, I did some digging for a story that I wrote for JewishBaseballMuseum.com. And it disputes that notion that pitchers didn't give Greenberg anything good to hit. In one of those games where he had 3 walks, and they used that as an example, hey, they're not giving him any pitches to hit, the opposing pitchers gave up 11 walks total to the game, to the Tigers. So they were wild the entire game, not just for Greenberg. Greenberg hit 2 homers against the St. Louis Browns in the Tigers' 149th game, to give him 58. So he had 5 to go, needing only 2 from tying Ruth. And in those final 5 games, where he supposedly wasn't getting any pitches to hit, he only received 3 walks. And in the last game of the season, he still went 3 for 3 with 1 walk. Unfortunately, none of those were home runs. So clearly he had some pitches to hit. And from his standpoint, Greenberg never bought into the notion that his religion prevented him from catching Ruth. He said, quote, "Some people still have it fixed in their minds that the reason I didn't break Ruth's record was because I was Jewish, and that the ball players did everything they could to stop me. That's pure baloney. The fact is quite the opposite. So far as I can tell, the players are mostly rooting for me, aside from the pitchers, of course." Greenberg was named MVP in 1940, and then he went into the Army. He was actually the first baseball player to enlist in the Army in May of 1941. So he enlists in the Army before anyone else, before Pearl Harbor. And he didn't play another baseball game until 1945. He lost out on 4 years of his prime. And you can see, there's so much. He was such a big, massive figure in baseball. And you can see a highlight. Here's his Hall of Fame video, just to kind of see it, take a look at some of his power, and also to see how big of a figure he was. If you can play that, Rabbi.
Despite losing 4 prime seasons to World War II and another to a fractured wrist, Hank Greenberg still walloped 331 home runs, including more than 46 times. His peak year was 1938, when the slugging right-hander hit 58 home runs after driving in 183 runs the year before. On the last day of the 1945 season, the fearsome slugger's 9th-inning grand slam won the pennant for the Tigers. A 2-time MVP, he closed out his career in Pittsburgh, shooting at Forbes Field's Greenberg Gardens. Greenberg was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1956.
Should be noted that he was the first Jewish player to be elected to the Hall of Fame, and the only other one right now is Sandy Koufax. And there's 3 other executives, Barney Dreyfuss, the Pittsburgh Pirates owner, Marvin Miller finally got in, and Bud Selig, the longtime commissioner. Greenberg's legacy went far beyond baseball. And during the 1930s, when many Jewish immigrants were struggling to assimilate in the United States, Greenberg was a standard bearer, a huge source of pride. He made them feel that they were part of America too. This is the trailer. I'm going to show you a trailer from Aviva Kempner's award-winning documentary, The Life of Times of Hank Greenberg. And you're going to see some familiar faces talking about the impact Greenberg had on them.
Growing up in the Bronx in the 30s and the early 40s, you thought of nothing else but baseball and Hank Greenberg. Not the biblical Moses, but the baseball Moses.
I wanted to be Hank Greenberg, I suppose, and I couldn't be Hank Greenberg, so the word in Yiddish is kveld. I just loved being part of a group that idolized Hank Greenberg.
When I was a kid, I always thought Hank Greenberg would be the first Jewish president. After all, he was the most successful Jew in America. He was good looking, he was tall, he was accomplished, he was well spoken. Why not?
6'4", as big as Schoolboy Rowe. My God, nobody ever saw a Jew that big.
Two-time winner of the American League's Most Valuable Player Award, Slugger Hank.
I can recall bigoted people in the stands yelling, "Hey, you kike, you're not supposed to be able to play ball."
I found that it was a spur to make me do better.
There it is. And it's a dive going out to left. Looks like it's in the stands for a home run.
And they recognized him everywhere. Some things say, "Hi, I went to school with you, Hank."
I have met, personally, 4 million people. I went to high school at the same time, Hank, and in fact, we all sat next to him, which was incredible. I guess they did it vertically.
He was the first professional ball player to enlist and go fight the Nazis. I thought he was fighting Hitler all by himself.
Call him the hero of heroes. Call him the champion of champions. I almost weep still remembering what that meant to us.
So goodbye, Mr. Hank, goodbye.
I joined the Beverly Hills Tennis Club because Hank Greenberg was a member. It's the only reason I joined. I don't play tennis.
The great Walter Matthau. And, I mean, that really kind of, just that little snippet, and I was trying to find a short snippet to show everyone kind of the impact that he had. And when I say he's one of the most important Jews of the first half of the 20th century, that's what I'm talking about, that he was someone that they felt proud of, a national superstar in sports, where sports was taking this hold on society and baseball, and he was their guy. So I think that was a great, you see his impact. And Hank wrote in his autobiography, being Jewish did carry with it a special responsibility. After all, I was representing a couple million Jews among 100 million Gentiles, and I was in the spotlight. I was there every day, and if I had a bad day, every jerk was calling me names, so I had to make good. Now, by the late 1930s, Hanks then also added, by the time Hitler came to power, I came to feel that if I, as a Jew, hit a homer, I was hitting one against Hitler. I got a little special interview here I want to show you. I had a chance to interview Greenberg's biographer. Actually, he wrote autobiographer, and then after he died, he wrote the rest of his biography. Ira Berkow wrote on Hank Greenberg. Ira, Chicago native, was a longtime Pulitzer Prize winning sports columnist for the New York Times. So if you read the Times, you've seen lots of Ira's columns, and I had a chance to talk to him about his relationship with Greenberg. Here you go.
Ira, tell me your first recollections of meeting Hank Greenberg.
Well, I met Hank Greenberg in about 1969 or 70, and I went to do an article on him, and we met in a hotel dining room at the Roosevelt Hotel. And I remember such presence, I mean, he was, well, I remember Shirley Povich once described Hank Greenberg, and this was fitting when I met him. And Shirley said that Hank was the perfect standard bearer for Jews. He was smart, he was proud, and he was big. And I met him, and he still had dark hair, some gray. He was, in his early 70s, maybe mid 60s, and his hair was slicked back. He had a lot of hair, and he was 6'4", a little hunched over now, but big and well dressed and imposing. And here was the great Hank Greenberg that I had not seen him play. My earliest memories of baseball were about the end of his career in 1947. But I had family members talk about Hank Greenberg, from a Jewish family, and they tell me, legendary stories about Hank Greenberg, some true, some not. But anyway, I grew up with legend of Hank Greenberg.
But you developed a relationship with him to the point where how did that come about?
Well, so we sat down to have lunch, and I said to him, Hank, I know this is a cliche question. You're always asked this, but before we do anything else, I just want to get it out of the way. Did they pitch to you in 1938 when you were going for Babe Ruth's hallowed home run record? It was 1938. He had 58 home runs with 5 games to go. The record was 60, of course. And when you say hallowed, it was only 11 years old, you know. And so he said, let me tell you something. He said, I know people like to say that I was Jewish and so they didn't want to pitch, the pitchers didn't want to pitch to me. He said, it's bunk. It's not true. He said, in those 5 games, he said, I was feeling tense. There was so much pressure on me. And I hit a lot of long balls. Some were caught, some were foul. And I got a number of hits, 5 or more hits. One St. Louis Browns pitcher was a rookie. He was intimidated. And so he walked me a couple of times. But otherwise, no. He said, I remember the Browns near the end of the season. And they had a first baseman named McQueen. And he was my friend. And I remember I had 2 strikes, and I hit a pop foul. And he dropped it on purpose so I could get another at bat. Okay. And then I had McGowan was an umpire who was my friend. He was behind the plate, and I hit a triple, or it was a triple. And then the third base coach was holding me up like this, and I said, I have a chance to get a home run. I had 56 home runs. And the throw came in, and Hank, as he described it, he was out by 5 fat feet. His friend McGowan, the umpire, called him safe. So he said, look, it's a canard that they weren't pitching to me and that I got a lot of breaks. There are a lot of people, a lot of guys who were my friends. They wanted me to break the record, including a lot of my teammates, but it didn't happen. And then through the years, we continued a friendship. And he became a source for me, that if something was happening in sports, I would call him, either on the record or off the record, and he would give me his opinion. And then when Bill Veeck died, and Bill Veeck was one of his closest friends, and I called Hank. I was doing a column for the Times, New York Times, on Veeck and what he meant and so forth, and I called Hank, and he gave me some opinions and views on Veeck, and I sent him the column, and he wrote me a letter back, and he said, Ira, you were the only sports writer in the country to call me about Bill Veeck. And you would think that, you know, he would have a slew of dozens calling him. And he said, and then he gave me like a Latin phrase, time flies and people forget the past. I don't exactly remember it, but he was literate. He was an autodidact. He went to 1 semester of college, and then he signed with the Tigers in 1929, I think, and 28. And but he read widely, and he liked to argue political opinions, and he was always fun to be with. Yeah.
And from reading the book, he was a very highly principled man and was very much willing to take a stand. With contracts, even as a rookie, he walked off the field. Yeah. When because he wasn't playing, he was frustrated. How did that approach help him withstand the abuse and the verbal abuse and things that he had to put up with?
Hank had confidence in himself, and he was big, and he was strong, and he was talented, but he was smart, and he was probably as smart as anybody in baseball, including the owners, and he knew what his talents were. And if his talents weren't perceived by the manager or the coaches or the general managers, well, he took a stand. And he in essence, hey, look at me, look what I can do. And it turned out to be the way he would take his stands. Years later, he was now in his late 70s, no, maybe late 60s. He went to a restaurant with his son, Steve. And this is emblematic of Hank the man. And a waiter comes over, and Hank orders a martini with 3 small olives. And so the waiter goes and he brings back the martini, and there's 1 big olive in the martini. And he says to the waiter, I asked for 3 small olives and you give me 1 big olive. And the waiter says something to him, and Hank gets furious and says something very negative to the waiter, who turns and runs away. And Steve says, Dad, that was unlike you. Why would you say something like that to the waiter? He said, well, I told him about the 3 olives that weren't right. We got one big olive. And he said, I refuse to apologize. And Steve said, no, Dad. What he said was, I profusely apologize. but the thing is, he's standing up even for the olives, you know. And this was Hank.
But did he share with you, though, what it was like for him to be that kind of an icon in that day, where he's revered by, a symbol for Jews everywhere, but on the same side, he's also the object of a lot of vitriol, including at a World Series that took place here in Chicago,
right.
35 Cubs.
Right, and some of the Cubs were thrown out of the game from the dugout. They were razzing him in 1935. In 1938, when he was going to break the record, for quite a while, he was the Jewish superstar in baseball, and wherever he went, Jews congregated around him and inviting him to dinners, and he appreciated all that. But after a while, he didn't want to be known early on as a Jewish baseball player. He wanted to be known as a baseball player and to be appreciated for his merits as a ball player. But as time went on and he began to understand and realize his significance to the Jewish community, and in 1938, when the Jews were having such in the 30s, having such a tough time in Europe, and particularly in Germany, of course, he said that, and he was also being reviled often from fans in the stands, and he said that every time that I hit a home run, it was a home run against Hitler, because Jews were supposed to be smaller, weaker, and not able to take care of themselves. And here is this, this great, sports hero who was not only just, hitting singles and doubles, but hitting home runs.
Ira is one of the great friend and just a legendary sports writer, and he is a great storyteller, as you can tell. I asked Ira again tell Ira, who was the greatest Jewish baseball player of all time, Koufax or Greenberg, and this is what he said. You got it there, number 6? Here we go.
Pick one. Greatest Jewish baseball player of all time. Hank Greenberg or Sandy Koufax?
Greenberg, for his time, was probably even more important than Koufax for the Jews, because this was the 1930s, and Greenberg stood out. Koufax, we were already assimilated now by the time Koufax came around, or pretty much assimilated, But for Hank to be doing what he did in that time, when discrimination for Jews around the world was horrific, I'm not going to say who was better. They both were great. Who may have made a greater impact in his time, and I would go for Hank for the times.
And I think you probably get a lot of people who would agree there. So let's go forward. So given the discrimination that Jews experience, it should not be a surprise that Jews actually played a role in helping to integrate baseball. Like African Americans, there were hotels in the South that did not want to take in Jews as guests. There was a story that goes in the early 1930s. At the time, the Giants had 4 Jewish players, and they arrived at a hotel only to have the manager turn them back, saying the Jews can't stay here. Bill, the Giants manager, to his credit, said, okay, then none of us will stay here. And the team found another hotel. And so obviously they sympathized with the African Americans went through. And there were along with prominent African American sports writers, there were Jewish sports writers during the 30s and 40s who lobbied baseball to integrate. And during the mid 40s, there was even a person by the name of Dr. Leon Levy. He owned a Philadelphia radio station, and he wanted to buy the Phillies and bring in African American talent. However, they were blocked by National League president Ford Frick. Yes, the same Ford Frick who lamented that Jews had to change their names 20 years earlier. Meanwhile, in Boston, Isadore Mushnick, a councilman, pressured the Red Sox to sign African American players. He threatened to ban Sunday games for the Red Sox if they at least didn't give him a tryout. So in 1945, Jackie Robinson and two other African American players traveled to Boston for that tryout. The Red Sox, though, never took it seriously. In fact, they were the last major league team to sign an African American player. Wait until 1959. Obviously a big loss considering the kind of player Jackie Robinson became. And everyone knows that Robinson eventually signed, that Branch Rickey eventually signed Robinson for the Dodgers. And here's where our story comes full circle. 1947, Robinson's first year, Hank Greenberg had intended to retire, but he was talking to playing one more year with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And Greenberg was well aware of the abuse being heaped on Robinson in his debut season, having gone through it himself. So there's a game. Pittsburgh's playing the Dodgers for the first time. And Greenberg's listening to his Pirate teammates just lighting into Robinson, which happened almost every game that Robinson played in that year. And it led to a moment that became part of the legend for both men. Robinson got a hit and stood next to Greenberg at first base. So here you have the Jewish icon reaching out to the African-American pioneer. Greenberg recalled, he stood beside me with his chin up like a prince. I had a feeling for him because of the way he'd been treated. I kept saying to him, don't let him get you down. You're doing fine. Keep it up. And that conversation was noted in the New York Times the next day with the headline, Hank Greenberg, hero of the Dodgers, Negro star. Robinson said after the game, class tells, it sticks out all over Mr. Greenberg. That moment struck a chord with Bud Selig when I asked him about Hank Greenberg's legacy in our interview. Play that.
He certainly was one of the great players of his generation, no question. Played with a lot of great players, Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams, and Babe Ruth was just ending when Hank came up. But he was a kid from the Bronx who became one of the great, great players in baseball. And I'll tell you what else he did. When he played with Pittsburgh, his kindness towards Jackie Robinson was legendary, and so I'll always... I have great respect for Hank. Certainly he was a great Jewish player, but more importantly, he was a great player and a wonderful human being.
So I want to conclude with this story. So in 1955, a rabbi in Brooklyn meets Jackie Robinson before a game, and it was shortly before the World Series was about to take place. And he says to Jackie, I want to give a sermon about this World Series opener, and you're the key player in it. Could you please tell me how you feel after 9 years in the majors? How do you feel about your experience thus far? And Robinson answered, funny you should ask. You're a Jewish minister. If I know anything about the Jews, I'll tell you I felt and still feel the same. I feel the way Jews must have felt during thousands of years of discriminations. You took a lot of guff, but you refused to play dead. Well, I'll never play dead for as long as I live. So Jackie Robinson and the Jews had this relationship, and it was very special. And I'm proud of the fact that Jews helped immigrate baseball. I'm going to leave you with one other item before we take questions. And I saw this while doing research for this. The Chelsea soccer, if you can put this up, Rabbi, that would be great. So the Chelsea Soccer Club and their owner, Roman Abramovich, commissioned an artist to create a mural of Jewish athletes who perished during the Holocaust. And the final piece was presented during an event at Stamford Bridge observing Holocaust Memorial Day in 2020. And the exhibit is named 49 Flames for the 49 Jewish athletes who perished during the Holocaust. And it's really just a beautiful tribute. And obviously the soccer owner felt very strongly about this. And we'll try to share the link to, it's called 49 Flames, and it writes about these Jewish athletes who unfortunately had their lives cut short. And we'll share that. Rabbi, can we share that later in the chat if people want to look at that, because it's really very moving. And with that, Rabbi, we'll open it to questions.
There's some conversation that was happening in our chat throughout. One of the questions from Gwen and Don was, have Jews been on the Cubs? And so there were some responses, Ken Holtzman and Larry Rothschild, Jason Marquis, Scott Feldman. Feldman's an interesting story, right? Steve Stone, Jack Peterson, Adam Greenberg, who we talked about last week. Any response to that, Ed, the Jewish president?
Yeah, there's been obviously several Jewish players on the Cubs, and I believe at the time we did the museum, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but the team that had the most Jewish players in Major League history was the White Sox. White Sox had the most, so that was a few years ago. I'm sure they're still up there, and maybe still number one.
You have two. Mitch writes in the chat that after Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax, the case can be made that Rosen is the next greatest Jewish baseball player. And
Al Rosen was a great player, and he had one of the greatest years of all time. Behind, right up there with what Koufax and Greenberg did. Is he won the American MVP in '53, and he almost won the Triple Crown. And unfortunately, he hurt his finger the year later, and he never was the same player. And he retired after the 1955 season. And again, there's also a story about him dealing with anti-Semitism and being, he was a big, strong guy. And there was a story that goes that I think they were playing the White Sox and they were razzing him, and he hears this razzing from the dugout, and he goes to the dugout, this big, strong guy, and says, okay, does any of you guys have any, the guy do the guys who are saying this, so they have the guts to come out and show me who you are? And none of them did, so that was his way of kind of putting down whatever was being said against him.
That's the last piece in the chat. We'd invite people, if you have a question or a comment to offer, to unmute yourself. And of course, we'd invite you to speak one at a time so that we can hear and see whoever it is speaking.
I'm seeing someone there.
Yeah. One from the chat here. In spite of the progress that's been made, Black baseball players have still been the targets of racist comments from fans in the stands. Adam Jones in Boston. Are there any recent examples of Jewish baseball players facing similar language from fans?
That's a good question. I have not heard that, and maybe someone could, and I would think we would have heard that. Again, there's several Jewish baseball players, and two of the best players right now in baseball, Alex Bregman, Houston Astros. I think he was the MVP runner-up a couple of years ago, and Max Fried, who's a great pitcher now for the Atlanta Braves, all-star caliber pitcher. And so there's a few. There's an interesting story. One player I did not include last week among my great Jewish athletes was Ryan Braun. You probably, and I probably should have included him, but he won the MVP award. But again, I feel bad, but I think he disgraced himself with what he did with steroids, and so I don't feel comfortable including him among the great Jewish athletes.
I have a observation. This is Mitch.
Hey, Mitch.
Jason Kipnis, when he was signed by the Cleveland Indians, big story ran in the Cleveland Jewish News about how the Indians had signed this Jewish ball player, Kipnis, and they went through his dad, and they had this whole story. And then about a week later, they ran a retraction. They said, well, his father is Jewish, his mother is not, and that in fact he was raised Catholic, and
right,
he has no Judaism in him.
That's right.
Interesting
Good story.
Also, Bernie Kosar, when he came to Cleveland, was recruited by all the Jewish mothers. Because he was this curly-haired, dark-haired guy from Miami. coming to, and when the Browns signed him, they all wanted him to show up, speak at their functions. And of course, he was not Jewish. So they're hungry for Jewish ball players.
Right, right.
I have a story about Hank Greenberg,
Yeah.
Don Packard here. I grew up in a, excuse me, I'm a little hoarse. I grew up in a small town in Michigan. We were the only Jewish family. And I don't think my dad ever had gone to a Major League Baseball game. It's 1945, and the Cubs we're supporters of the Tigers, excuse me. And Hank Greenberg had just come back from the service late in 1945, and my dad decided to take the three boys on the Labor Day weekend and drive there. He didn't have any tickets. So we drove to Detroit, we went to Briggs Stadium, and of course they didn't have any seats left. So we bought standing room only for the doubleheader, and we got to see Hank Greenberg. They were playing, I believe, the St. Louis Browns, and if I'm not mistaken, I think they won both games, and it was a great experience.
Yeah, that's a great story. And, he beat the Cubs. The Tigers beat the Cubs twice in the World Series during his career at 35. And he came back in 45. And I think he had a pretty good series in 45 after having not played in 4 years. If anyone has a question, otherwise I have another Greenberg story that my friend Jonathan had just sent me that probably worth telling. I'm not sure. I don't have it right in front of me, but I'm going to try to tell it the right way. So we get talk about Sandy Koufax and Yom Kippur. In 1934, it was Rosh Hashanah, and the Tigers are in the midst of a pennant race. And there was some question whether or not Greenberg could play, should be allowed to play. And there was a rabbi in Detroit who kind of looked very deep in the Torah, rabbi, and came up with something that said in Rosh Hashanah, the kids were playing. I believe that's the story. And so if the Torah allowed playing on Rosh Hashanah, certainly Hank Greenberg could play on Rosh Hashanah because it was a big game and they were in this very tight race. And I think Greenberg hit either 2 home runs. I know he hit the game-winning home run that day. And the next day, one of the newspapers printed the headline in Hebrew, honoring Greenberg as the player who, as the star of the game. I'm pretty sure he says that he didn't play in the high holidays again, but I'm not sure that that was exactly the case, but that's one of the famous Rosh Hashanah, one of the high holidays involving Hank Greenberg. And it's interesting because he says that from reading the book, he did not embrace this idea of being this Jewish icon. He wanted to be just a player. And it wasn't something that he felt proud. I would say he wasn't comfortable with it. And it wasn't really until that he got more deeper in his career and he saw how much it meant to people that he kind of embraced it. But it wasn't something that he necessarily thought was a great thing in the early part of his career.
Of course, that great machloket, the great debate within the Jewish community still about whether is it permitted to play basketball on Shabbat, right? And there's great conversation, modern commentary, and they seek the old stuff to answer that question. Can we play baseball on Rosh Hashanah? I've never done it.
Well, I don't know, but what about golf? Is there a special dispensation for golf, Rabbi?
Jody Genghis, I see your hand.
I was just wondering, besides, let's say, Sid Luckman and Marshall Goldberg and whatever, who would you consider among the great Jewish football players?
There was a quarterback that I didn't get into named Benny Friedman, the quarterback at Michigan during the 1920s. And then he went and played for the Giants in the 30s. And he was a great quarterback. And I believe he's in the Hall of Fame. Someone might have to verify that for me, but I think he's in the Hall of Fame, and just a great quarterback. I'm trying to think, if people ask me these questions and I always kind of blank out. I'm sure that there are several great, I think the Chiefs have a Jewish player right now. Schwartz is one of their tackles. There's several right now playing in the NFL. Who's the best? I mean, Sutton Luckman has to be the best one. I don't know who number 2 is, but maybe someone else out there can give me a hand with that one.
I guess Julian Edelman is today.
Edelman, that's a good one. And Edelman does, you know, and he very much feels like I know he did something honoring the Jews recently, but he's a great player.
Allegretti.
Huh?
Allegretti.
Allegretti, right? That's a good one, Ron. That's right, it's your buddy. So in place, the Chiefs have 2 Jewish
linemen. 2 Jewish linemen.
Jewish linemen. Well, there you go. We can move the world. Why can't the Bears need more Jewish linemen? Let's go work on it, Ron.
Merv Pregelman was an All-American lineman at the University of Michigan sometime in the early 40s. He's from Lansing, Michigan. Merv Pregelman.
I'll work on that for next time because that's a good. I mean, there was a lineman, Ryan Mix, who played for the San Diego Chargers, who was a great player. There's a few out there, you know. But yeah, the Chiefs having 2 Jewish linemen, great one, Ron. Appreciate you bringing that one up. Are we good? Well, I want to thank
the New England Patriots had a kicker in training camp one time, but I don't think he made the team. I think his name was Mark Littner, was a kicker in the New England Patriots training camp, as I understand.
There's a Jewish kicker out there now. I can't remember his name. And obviously, for a long time, everyone felt that Robbie Gould was Jewish, G-O-U-L-D, but he's not Jewish. But there, you know, I mean, there's players out there. There's players in basketball. I mean, I never knew there was a Jewish hockey player, Larry Zeidel. That was a good one. And you just, you know, you just don't realize it. And obviously, in other sports, and you're going to be seeing Jewish athletes in the Olympics coming up. And speaking of which, I'll give you a preview for next time, which I think is going to be a really next Tuesday, our last one. We're going to do something on Israel and the Olympics, and we're going to tell the story kind of starting at 1972 and that tragedy, and maybe telling you some things that you didn't even know about what happened that, you know, I've done further study on that. I mean, it's just incredible what happened that day and how it could have easily have been prevented. And you take that tragedy and you go flash forward to the Israelis not giving in and coming back and showing the kind of people that they are, and eventually winning a gold medal the first gold medal in 2004. And to see that, and we're going to have a film of that ceremony that you really don't want to miss. It is so moving, especially for those of us who kind of remember Munich and kind of know how far they came. So, and then the last part of that, I have a special interview with Peter Kurz, who's the executive director of or I think he calls himself the general manager of the Israel baseball team, Israel, which is going to compete in the Olympics in Tokyo this year. There's going to be a Jewish team in the Olympics. And so Peter's going to talk about that. Peter's from New York. Lived in Israel for 40 years, and just a great force of nature, a great guy. But he's going to talk about that baseball team. But we're also going to ask him about the culture of sports in Israel, and I think he's got some really interesting things to say about that. Some interesting perspectives. So I'm hoping everyone can join me next time. I'm really thrilled that have the number of people on here is overwhelming, and for especially something we're trying for the first time. So. Hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you next week.